a $4 billion project. They'd been discussing for 3 weeks, hadn't got anywhere. They decided to invite one of my trainers and teach them the hats, and in one afternoon they had an outcome. In other words, you get very quick outcomes. Now that's surprising, because at first people say, oh, but all these hats are going to complicate things, going to take so long. Not at all. It reduces time dramatically. Because so much time in meetings is spent on ego exercises, just proving someone wrong, minor points, unimportant points, and so on and so on. Now with regard to the sequence of hats, so there's no fixed sequence. I'll just give a broad thing. You always would start with a blue hat. What are we here for? What is the focus? What are we going to do? You would always end with a blue hat, rather like two bookends. What is the outcome? What is the result? Under the first blue hat, you'd also discuss and set up the sequence in which you're going to use the hats. If, for example, you feel there are strong emotions, you'd have a red hat right at the beginning. If there's not strong emotions and you want to explore the subject, you'd start with a white hat, and then you would move on to a green hat, possibilities, alternatives, and then you'd assess the alternatives with the yellow, black, white, and red. If you're assessing something from the beginning, it always makes sense to put the yellow hat before the black hat. The reason is that when you use the black hat and you find lots of negatives, you're not going to make much effort to find the values. Much better start with the values, then by all means move on to the negatives and so on. These are some general guidelines. There are training programs for full use of the hats and so on. But generally speaking, it's very simple, parallel thinking, and, as I say, much, much quicker than argument. As I say, to within 1/10 the amount of time you need for argument. Now, I'll say a word or two about lateral thinking as such, and it's related to the way the brain works. By far the most important behavior of the brain is humor, far more important than reason. Reason tells us virtually nothing about the brain. Any sorting system run backwards can reason. But humor depends on a system which forms patterns, and all patterning systems are asymmetric. Patterns: one day a fellow gets up in the morning, he's got 11 pieces of clothing to put on. He said, in how many ways could I get dressed? He programs his IBM PC to go through it. Computer takes 40 hours of non-stop working. That's not surprising, because 11 pieces of clothing, you have just 39,916,800 ways of getting dressed. If you tried one every minute of your waking life, you'd need to live to be 76 years old, doing nothing else your whole life. That would not be very convenient. Fortunately for us, the brain is specifically designed to allow incoming information to organize itself as patterns. How it does that, I described in a book I wrote in 1969 called The Mechanism of Mind, which describes how the neurons in the brain allow information to organize itself into patterns. That book was read by the leading physicist in the world, Professor Mario Gell-Mann, who got his Nobel Prize for discovering the quark, became very motivated. He commissioned a team of top computer experts to simulate what I said in the book, said, yes, it works exactly as you predict, and he's been a great supporter ever since. Pattern-making system. Now, what happens in patterns is they are asymmetric. What does that mean? The definition of a pattern is at any moment you have a higher probability of going in one direction than in any other. We could imagine that as a track. You're far more likely to go along the track than to step off the track. But pattern systems are asymmetric. What does that mean? It means you can go from C to A, but not from A to C. That's asymmetry. Now that gives rise to two phenomena in the human brain, one of which is humor. In In humor, we're going along there, and we move laterally. Once we're there, in hindsight, totally logical. There's a very simple example I give. There's an old man of 90, dies, and he goes down to hell. As he's wandering around, he sees a friend of his, also age 90, sitting there with a beautiful young lady sitting on his knee. So he says to his friend, he says, "Are you sure this is hell? Because you seem to be having rather a good time." The fellow looks up and said, "No," he said, "it's hell all right." He said, "I'm the punishment for her." Absolutely logical. And that is the essence of humor, which is that once you make the jump, absolutely logical. And exactly the same process happens in creativity. We're going along the main track. We move laterally. Once we're there, in hindsight, totally logical. And that's a very important point. Far too many people believe creativity is being different for the sake of being different. That is not creativity, that's crazytivity. In creativity, once you have the idea, it has real value and is logical. But making the jump, that's what lateral thinking is all about. There are various techniques for doing it. I'll just mention a couple rather quickly. So we're going along. One of the techniques, which sounds simple but needs a lot of discipline, is challenge, where you say, yes, that's the normal idea we use, the normal perception concept. Let's block it for the moment. Not to say it's wrong, not at all, but block it in order to explore other possibilities. Can be very powerful. I'll give you a very strong example. In 1970, I was doing some work for Shell Oil in London, and I said, when you drill an oil well, you drill it straight down. I have done so for 80 years. No problem, very satisfactory, didn't need thinking about. I said, let's challenge that. Why not drill it down to the level of the oil seam and then horizontally? Said, we can't do it because the drill won't go around the corner. I said, yes, it will. If you use a hydraulic head, you can pull it round. Today, almost every oil well in the world is drilled like that, because you get between 3 and 6 times as much oil from this well as from that well. In fact, Statoil in Norway has one well going 10 kilometers horizontally. The reason is obvious. If this is the oil-bearing seam, here you just dip through it, here you're exposed for a long time. But it took 80 years for that change to happen, 80 years. Then there are other processes. There's provocation. Provocation, we're going along, we set up a provocation. Now I invented the word PO, meaning provocative operation. Then we use a mental operation called movement. Move there. Once we're there, in hindsight, it makes sense. I'll give you a couple of examples of that. One time I was in California talking to the whole ecology group, and they said we have a problem with rivers. Factories built on rivers put out pollution, people downstream suffer. So as a provocation, I said, PO, the factory is downstream of itself. That sounds pretty impossible. How can the factory be at A and B at the same time? From it comes a very, very simple idea. Normally, you take in your water, you put out your pollution. All we need to do is legislate that if you build a factory on the river, your input must always be downstream of your own output. So you're the first to get your pollution. That has now become legislation in 13 countries. Very, very simple. Another example, and this was used by a fellow who came to one of my seminars and became very interested. His name was Ron Barbaro, and he worked for Prudential Insurance in Canada. He was chief executive. And part of their business, of course, is life insurance. And you have a life insurance policy, and when you die, the company pays out to your family or other beneficiaries. So one day he says to himself, PO, you die before you die. Sounds pretty impossible. From that comes a very simple idea that he introduced, that if you got a serious illness, they would immediately pay 75% of the death benefits. The other 25% stayed in the same place. That's called living needs benefits. It's now in use in virtually every insurance company in North America, because now you have money to pay for hospital care and other things as well. But that changed an idea which had been the same for 123 years. And it's no great risk, because the time between getting a serious illness and dying compared to your years of paying premiums is tiny, so it's not a high-risk area and so on. I'll give you one more example. It happened not so long ago, and I was talking to senior Boeing engineers, and as a provocation, I said, Poe, airplanes should land upside down. Now, if you're an aeronautical engineer, that's not a very attractive idea. And there are many reasons why it wouldn't work too well. But from it comes a very interesting idea. Planes landed upside down, the wings would give you downward thrust. From that comes the following idea. That we have a normal plane, normal wings, and then we have another set of wings, rather smaller, upside down. These give you downward thrust. So the plane now has a negative bias. And if you need lift in an emergency, you retract these or flap them up or rotate them, and instantly you get extra lift. Now 70% of plane crashes are caused by the inability to switch on extra lift immediately. This is a way of doing it. They're very interested in it, they're looking into it to see if they can make it practical and so on. So starting with a provocation, ending up with a very interesting idea. And there are ways of setting up provocations, ways of using provocation. There's nothing magic about it. Then there's a further technique, which is that we're going along. Normally we start our thinking here. If somehow we started somewhere else, we might hit that track and then we could use it. The history of science is full of examples where important ideas were triggered by random events, like the apple falling on Newton's head. But how do we get that idea? We cannot choose it, because if we chose it, it would lie along our normal thinking. So we use chance. And the simplest is a random word. Now, logician philosophers get very upset. They say, how can a random word help? It could help in any subject. How can it be of use? The answer is very simple, that in a patenting system, imagine you live in a house and you go into a restaurant and you take the most usual road and eventually get to the restaurant. When you get there, one of your guests say, how did you come here? And you explain. And he says, oh no, you could go very simply from here. In other words, if you're out there, you can access things. If you're here, you can't, because you follow the normal line. So any random input will greatly increase your chance of having different ideas. It can be very powerful. One time in South Africa for a steel company called ISCOR, one of my trainers running the workshop introduced just one afternoon the random word. That afternoon they generated 21,000 new ideas, just using that one technique. So these processes can be used quite formally, quite deliberately. It's not sort of a matter of sitting by a stream and playing Baroque music or something. They can be used quite formally, quite deliberately. So these are aspects of lateral thinking.